The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green and gold beneath a pale winter sky. Towering pines swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker's sharp rhythm echoed. Hidden deep within that vastness, where no roads led and no neighbors came calling, stood a small cabin. It was rough-hewn, built from logs that had darkened over time, and it blended so completely into its surroundings that one might pass it by without noticing. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, the only sign of life in a place that belonged more to the deer and birds than to people. Inside that cabin lived a man named Elias. He was broad-shouldered and strong, with hand hardened by years of work and a face weathered by sun and wind. Most days began and ended the same for him. At dawn, he rose to the faint gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. He brewed a small pot of coffee, black and bitter, the smell filling the cabin with something warm, though fleeting. Then he pulled on his boots, shrugged into his thick coat, and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. Every morning, without fail, Elias started with the woodpile. His axe had become an extension of his arm, and each swing split the logs cleanly, the sharp crack would ringing out through the forest. It was a sound he had grown accustomed to, a steady rhythm that kept him company when no one else did. He stacked the split logs neatly, always making sure there was enough of the stove to keep him warm through the long nights. Afterward, he would head into the trees with his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the underbrush for rabbits or deer, not because he hunted for sport, but because it was the way he fed himself. Hunting, chopping, mending. This was the rhythm of Elias's life, and it had been for years. The forest, though harsh, gave him everything he needed. It also gave him silence. There were days when he might not hear another human voice, days when even his own felt strange when he spoke aloud to himself. He had learned to live with the quiet, to move through the hours without expectation, as if the world beyond the trees had ceased to exist. Inside the cabin, the air was scented with pine and the faint memory of wood smoke. The place was tidy, not from care but from habit. A pair of boots sat neatly by the door. The table bore the marks of years of use, knife cuts and burns, and against the far wall, an old rocking chair creaked when the wind slipped through the gaps in the wood. Everything inside spoke of someone who had long since stopped trying to make things new. On a small shelf rested a handful of objects that didn't belong to Forrest. A faded photograph, its corners curled, a child's wooden toy, worn smooth by small fingers, and a locket, the clasp long broken. Those objects were all that remained of a life Elias once had. Years ago, before the forest became his refuge, he had lived in a small town with a family of his own. His wife, Claire, had been the one to convince him to build a life near the woods, saying she loved how the air there smelled of pine and freedom. Their son, Samuel, had been a bright-eyed boy who loved to follow him around, pretending to chop wood with a stick. But one winter night, everything changed. A wagon overturned on a frozen road. By the time Elias reached them, there was nothing to be done. The cold had taken them both before help could arrive. After that night, the town felt like a graveyard. Every street corner reminded him of what he had lost. So he left, disappearing into the trees with only an axe, a rifle, and the unbearable weight of grief. The forest didn't ask questions. It didn't look at him with pity. It simply took him in and allowed him to disappear. And for years, he had done exactly that. Now, as the days passed into seasons and seasons into years, he had convinced himself that this was all his life would ever be. The world outside these trees moved on without him, and that was fine. People came with their noise and their needs, and he had nothing left to give them. Better to stay here, where the only sounds were the wind and the cry of the hawk. That morning, after hunting, he returned with a rabbit slung over his shoulder. He skinned it quickly and set it over the stove in a simple stew. As the pot simmered, filling the cabin with a savory scent, he sat by the window, staring out at the world beyond. Snow had begun to fall lightly, each flake catching the light as it drifted down. The forest always felt different in the snow, quieter, softer, like it had been wrapped in a thick blanket. He watched for a long while, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, until the stew was ready. Meals were a solitary affair. He ate slowly, not out of enjoyment but out of habit, his mind wandering. Sometimes he thought of what it might be like to hear laughter in the cabin again, to sit across from someone and talk about the day's work. But those thoughts only hurt, so he pushed them away. He had told himself long ago that such things were for other people, people who hadn't already lost everything. After cleaning up, Elias went back to work. He mended a section of the roof where the snow had begun to leak through, checked his traps, and sharpened his tools. When the sun began to sink behind the trees, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, he returned to the cabin, lit a lantern, and sat down in the rocking chair. The chair creaked beneath him, a familiar sound in the otherwise still air. Night in the forest was absolute. Darkness pressed against the windows, and the cold deepened, but the cabin stood firm, warmed by the fire in the stove. Elias sat for a long time, staring at the flames, his thoughts drifting like smoke. He thought of Claire's laughter, of Samuel's small hands gripping his own, of the life that had once been so full. And then he thought of the years that had come after, empty years, where every day felt like a repetition of the last. As he finally rose to go to bed, he glanced once more at the photograph on the shelf. "Another day done," he murmured quietly, his voice rough with disuse. Then he blew out the lantern and let the darkness close in. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering the tracks of a man who had long ago accepted that his life would end here, in solitude. The road out of town was little more than a path of frozen mud and half-buried stones. Along that road walked a woman named Margaret, her coat threadbare and pulled tightly around her thin shoulders. Behind her trailed 3 children, each step slower than the last, their small boots leaving uneven tracks in the snow. They had been walking for hours, the pale winter sun offering no warmth, only a faint light to guide them forward. Margaret's eldest, a boy of 12 named Henry, walked with his jaw clenched and his small hands curled into fists inside worn gloves. He carried the heaviest of their bundles, a sack that barely held together with patches, filled with the last of their belongings. Behind him, his 9-year-old sister, Clara, tried to keep up, but her legs were shorter and tired faster. Every so often, she would glance at their youngest brother, Peter, who was only 5 and whose cheeks were red from the cold. Peter clung to Margaret's hand, his other arm wrapped around a tattered stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Their journey had begun weeks ago, but it felt like months. Once, they had a home, a small cottage on a farm with a father who filled the house with laughter. But last spring had brought tragedy. Their father fell ill suddenly, and within weeks he was gone. Without him, the farm went under, the debts piled up, and one by one, the few possessions that were sold just to keep food in their bellies. When even that wasn't enough, they had been forced to leave. Since then, Margaret had done everything she could to keep her children alive. She worked where she could, took shelter where people offered it, and endured the stares and whispered pity of townsfolk who never once lifted a hand to truly help. At first, they moved from town to town, hoping for something to change, but everywhere they went, the answer was the same: no work, no shelter, no future. Now, the only thing they had left was determination. Margaret would not give up. She couldn't. Every time she thought she might collapse from exhaustion, she looked at the faces of her children and forced herself to take another step. The path wound through the trees, their bare branches clawing at the pale sky. A cold wind cut through the thin fabric of their clothes, carrying the sharp scent of pine and frost. Margaret's feet ached in her worn boots, each step a battle. They had eaten only a piece of stale bread that morning, and now her stomach was an empty knot. But she said nothing. There was no comfort in voicing hunger when there was no food left to offer. "We'll stop soon," she said quietly, glancing back at Clara and Peter. Clara nodded, lips pressed together as she pulled her coat tighter. Peter only looked up at her with wide, tired eyes. Henry said nothing at all. He had learned, in the months since their father's death, to swallow his feelings and push forward. As they walked, Margaret thought of the last conversation she'd had in the last village they'd passed through. The innkeeper's wife, an older woman with kind but weary eyes, had told her in a low voice about a man who lived alone deep in the forest. "He's rough, but not cruel," the woman had said. "Doesn't much like company, but maybe he'd help. If anyone would, it'd be him." It was a fragile thread of hope, but it was all Margaret had. She didn't know the man's name, didn't know exactly where he lived, only that he was out there, somewhere among the trees. So she had gathered her children and followed the path into the woods, praying they would find him before hunger and cold took them first. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to darken. Winter days were short, and already the light was fading from the world. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, clinging to their coats and hair. Peter stumbled, his small body swaying, and Margaret knelt quickly, pulling him into her arms. "Just a little farther," she whispered, brushing the snow from his flushed cheeks. "We can do this." Clara came closer, placing a hand on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, what if there's no house? What if no one's out here?" Margaret forced a smile she didn't feel. "Then we'll keep walking until we find somewhere else. We always do, don't we?" Clara nodded, though her eyes were full of worry. When they resumed walking, Henry shifted the bundle on his back and moved up beside his mother. "You think this man will let us stay?" His voice was quiet, almost flat. "I hope so," Margaret said. "I don't know what else to do." For a while, no one spoke. Their boots crunched on the frozen ground, and the sound echoed strangely in the stillness. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing on all sides, but Margaret kept her gaze fixed forward. She could not afford to think about failure. Failure meant her children would sleep tonight in the open, with nothing but thin coats between them and the cold. As dusk deepened, they came across a clearing where the snow lay untouched and pure. Margaret paused there, breathing heavily, her arms aching from holding Peter. They needed rest, but she was terrified of stopping. If they stopped, she feared they might never get up again. That was when Clara spotted it. A faint wisp of smoke curling into the sky, just visible above the trees to the north. "Mama!" she cried, pointing with a trembling hand. "Look!" Margaret's heart leapt. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was out here. Could it be the man they had been told about? She followed Clara's gaze, and there, barely visible in the fading light, she saw it too. Hope surged in her chest, bright and sharp. "We're going that way," she said, her voice firm. "Hold on, everyone." The last stretch was the hardest. The path narrowed and became steeper, the snow deeper. But the promise of warmth and shelter drove them on. Margaret carried Peter as long as she could before Henry insisted on taking him for a while. They stumbled through the trees, closer and closer, until finally the faint outline of a cabin came into view. It was a small structure, built from rough logs, with light spilling from the windows. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. It looked humble, lonely even, but to Margaret might as well have been a castle. Relief so intense it was almost painful washed over her. "We made it," she whispered. They stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, gathering their courage. Then Margaret stepped forward, her boots crunching in the snow. She mounted the steps to the porch, raised her hand, and knocked on the door. Her knuckles were white from the cold, but her heart pounded hotter than it had in months. This was their last hope. If this man turned them away, she had no plan left. Inside the cabin, they heard movement, slow footsteps, a chair scraping across the wooden floor. The children clung to her, their breaths clouding in the air. Then the door creaked open, and a tall, broad man with a thick beard stood before them. His eyes narrow in surprise at the sight of a weary woman and 3 children standing on his doorstep in the snow. Margaret drew, in a shaky breath. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We need help." The heavy wooden door groaned as Elias pushed it open. The cold air swept in immediately, biting at his skin, but it wasn't the chill that stopped him short. On his porch stood a woman wrapped in a thin coat, her face pale and weary, and 3 children huddled close around her legs. Snow clung to their boots and clothes, and their breaths came out in small, shaky clouds. For a moment, the sight was so unexpected that Elias simply stared, unsure if he was dreaming. Margaret swallowed hard. She had rehearsed the words in her head for the last mile of their walk. But now, looking into the sharp eyes of the man before her, all she could manage was a quiet, "Please, we need shelter, just for tonight." The eldest boy straightened under Elias's gaze, trying to look brave, while the middle girl clung to her mother's coat, and the youngest peeked out from behind her skirt with wide, fearful eyes. They were thin, far too thin, and their clothes were worn through, the fabric frayed at the edges. Elias's first instinct was to say no. He had spent years alone, and strangers at his door were a complication he didn't need. Yet something in the woman's voice, in the way her children trembled, cut through the wall he had built around himself. He grunted, still unsure, and opened the door wider. "Come in. Get out of the cold," he said finally. Relief flashed across Margaret's face, so quickly it almost broke his heart. She ushered the children inside, guiding them past him with gentle hands. The cabin was warm compared to the freezing air outside, and the children stood for a moment, blinking against the sudden change in temperature. "Sit by the fire," Elias instructed, gesturing to the worn rug in front of the hearth. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the howling wind. Margaret hesitated only a moment before sinking onto the rug with Peter in her lap, while Henry and Clara crouched close to the flames. Their hands stretched toward the heat, and a faint sigh escaped from each of them as the warmth finally reached their fingers. Elias studied them in silence. He wasn't used to guests. The cabin felt smaller now, filled with the sound of shivering breaths and the faint crackle of the fire. "How long have you been walking?" he asked gruffly. "Since morning," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "We've been traveling for days." "And why here?" His tone was blunt, but not cruel. "We heard of a man who lives deep in the woods," she explained softly. "Someone said you might help. We didn't know where else to go." Her words settled heavily between them. Elias crossed his arms over his chest, looking at her more closely now. There was exhaustion in her face, yes, but also a quiet strength. She had brought 3 children to the forest in winter. That wasn't the act of someone weak. He sighed and stepped toward the table. "You all look half frozen. Sit still. I'll get you something warm." Margaret murmured her thanks as Elias ladled stew from the pot on the stove into 4 bowls. It wasn't much, just rabbit potatoes, but when he set the bowls on the table, the smell alone made the children's eyes widen. "Go on," he said. "Eat." Henry helped Clara and Peter climb onto the bench, while Margaret followed slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up a spoon. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of spoons scraping against bowls and the soft hum of the fire. The children ate as though they hadn't seen food in days, which, Elias realized, might not be far from the truth. When they were finished, Elias sat across from them, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "You said just for the night?" Margaret nodded quickly. "Yes. I won't trouble you longer than that. We just needed a safe place. Somewhere warm. We'll move on in the morning." "Move on to where?" Elias asked. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to answer, but nothing came. Finally, she shook her head. "I don't know yet." Elias looked at the 3 children, pale, tired, and clearly used to go without, and something inside him shifted. He knew what it was to lose everything. He knew what it was to walk through life with nothing but the weight of survival pressing down on your shoulders. These children didn't need another night in the cold. They needed rest. They needed a break from the world that had already been too cruel to them. "You can stay here tonight," he said firmly. "There's room on the floor for blankets." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back. "Thank you. We'll be gone at first light." He didn't answer that. Instead, he stood, rummaged for extra blankets, and spread them out near the fire. The children curled up together, their small bodies huddled close, and for the first time in days, Margaret saw them relax. Their breathing evened out, the lines of worry in their little faces softening as sleep claimed them quickly. Margaret remained awake a while longer, sitting near the fire with her arms wrapped around her knees. Elias busied himself tidying the kitchen, though his eyes flicked to her now and then. He could see the exhaustion in her every movement, the way she sat like someone who had been holding herself together for far too long. "You should sleep too," he said finally. "I will," she murmured. "I just needed a moment." Elias didn't press her. He understood. There had been plenty of nights in his own life when sleep had felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, when closing his eyes meant facing the memories waiting in the dark. Eventually, she lay down beside her children, pulling the blankets tightly around them. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, and she was asleep, Elias stood there for a while, staring at the four of them bundled on his floor. An unfamiliar feeling crept into his chest. The cabin had been silent for so long, but tonight there was a new sound, the soft breathing of people who depended on him, if only for one night. As he turned down the lantern and settled into his chair, Elias told himself this was temporary. Tomorrow they would be on their way, and his cabin would return to the quiet he had always known. Yet, as he listened to the faint sound of Peter's small snores and the gentle rustle of blankets, he couldn't shake the thought that something in his life had already begun to change. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The morning came slow and pale, a weak sun stretching long beams of light across the snow outside the cabin. Elias rose early, as he always did, expecting the quiet of his routine. But as he stepped out of his room, the sight before him was different from every morning he had known for years. For figures were still sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, their shapes bundled in blankets. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure what to make of the sound of soft, steady breathing that filled the room. He moved as quietly as he could, putting on his boots and stepping outside to start the day's chores. The cold air bit his skin, familiar and grounding. He split within slow, even strikes, his breath forming clouds around his face. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin. The woman, Margaret, and her children had come out of nowhere. He had thought he wanted no company, but now he wasn't so sure. Something about the way the children had fallen asleep in front of the fire stayed in his mind. When he returned an hour later, the cabin was stirring. The children were awake, rubbing their eyes, and Margaret was kneeling near the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. She looked up quickly when he came in. "I hope we didn't trouble you too much," she said softly. "You were quiet enough," he replied, setting down the armful of logs. He hesitated, then added, "There's water in the barrel outside if you want to wash up." Margaret nodded gratefully. She guided the children out one by one to splash their faces in the icy water. When they came back inside, cheeks pink from the cold, Elias was already setting out bowls and bread. He wasn't used to preparing food for others, but it felt wrong not to. Breakfast was simple, bread, and what stew was left from the night before. The children ate with the same silent focus as the evening before, though a little less desperately now that their bellies had something in them. Clara, the middle child, looked up shyly and whispered, "Thank you, sir," before going back to her meal. After breakfast, Margaret began to gather their few belongings. "We'll be out of your way soon," she said. Her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. Elias paused in the middle of stacking wood. Something in him resisted the thought of opening the door and sending them back into the frozen world. "You've nowhere to go, do you?" he asked. Margaret's hands stilled. She glanced down at her children before answering honestly, "No." He studied her for a long moment. She looked tired to her bones, but there was something fierce in her eyes. She hadn't given up. "Then stay," he said finally, "just for a little while, until you find somewhere else." Margaret blinked, as if she hadn't heard him right. "Are you sure?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't," he said, his tone gruff. "This cabin's got room, and I could use an extra pair of hands around the place." Relief flooded her expression, softening the lines of worry that had been etched there for months. "Thank you," she said again, more quietly this time. Life in the cabin changed after that day. At first, it was awkward. Elias had been alone for so long that the constant movement and chatter of children felt like a disruption. He had to remind himself to be patient when they ran through the cabin or left muddy boots near the door. The silence he'd grown used to was gone, replaced by the sound of small feet and curious voices. But it wasn't all bad. Claire began to hum to herself while sweeping, and Peter's laughter, though rare at first, started to come more easily when he chased after the old hound that sometimes wandered onto porch. Henry, serious and reserved, spent most of his time outside helping Elias with wood chopping or carrying buckets of water. The boy never complained, even when his arms ached. Margaret took over much of the cooking. Though she had little to work with, the meals she made were warm and comforting. She also cleaned without being asked, her hands always busy, as though she needed to earn their keep in every way she could. For Elias, who had lived in a cabin where everything stayed in the same place for years. It was strange to see small touches of care in the way things were arranged. The table was wiped clean after every meal, blankets were folded neatly, and the smell of fresh bread began to drift through the house on days when she managed to make it. As days passed, the edges of formality between them began to wear away. The children started to speak more freely around him. Clara asked questions about the forest, what animals lived there, what the trees were called. Peter followed him around like a shadow, fascinated by everything he did. Henry, though still reserved, started to listen closely to his instructions on how to split wood properly. Margaret noticed a change, too. In the evenings, when the children were asleep, she sometimes found herself talking with Elias by the fire. It wasn't much at first, a few words about the weather or the work that needed doing, but over time those conversations stretched longer. They spoke of the forest, of how he had learned to live out here alone, and cautiously of their hopes for what might come next. There were small moments of connection that surprised them both. The first time Clara laughed so hard she snorted, Elias found himself chuckling softly. When Margaret caught him doing it, she smiled, really smiled, and for a moment he felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years. On the fourth night of their stay, a snowstorm swept over the forest, covering the cabin in a thick blanket of white. While the wind howled outside, they sat close around the fire. Margaret mended a tear in Peter's coat, while Elias whittled a small wooden bird from a spare piece of pine. When he finished, he handed it to Peter, who looked at it with wide eyes before clutching it tightly. "Thank you," Peter whispered, his voice shy but full of wonder. Elias nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. It had been years since he'd made anything for someone else. By the time the storm cleared, it had been a week since the night they first knocked on his door. The cabin no longer felt like a solitary place. It was noisy and messy and full of small disruptions, but Elias couldn't deny that it also felt alive. One evening, as Margaret cleared the table and the children drifted off to their blankets, Elias realized something. For the first time since he'd buried his own family, he didn't dread the sound of footsteps in his home. The presence of these four strangers had begun to pull him back into the world, little by little, without him even noticing. By the time the first signs of spring began to show in the forest, the snow melting into small streams that carved paths through the trees, Elias knew they would need more supplies. The winter had been long, and between 5 mouths to feed and the wear on their tools, the cabin stores were running low. So, for the first time since Margaret and the children had arrived, he hitched up his old wagon and told her they'd need to go into town together. Margaret hesitated when he suggested it. "You think it's wise?" she asked, her voice low. She was seated at the table, sewing a patch into Clara's skirt. Elias pulled on his coat. "Supplies won't walk to us," he said. "We need flour, sugar, nails, thread, things we can't make here. And I can't carry all of it alone. Besides, the children can stay here today. Just you and me." She nodded, though he could see the worry flicker in her eyes. She hadn't been to a town since the last one that turned them away. Still, there was no choice. They left Henry in charge of his siblings and set off down the narrow track that led to the small settlement 5 miles away. The journey took the better part of an hour. Margaret sat on the wagon bench beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The forest slowly gave way to open fields, and soon rooftops came into view. It was a small place, no more than clustered buildings, but to Margaret, it felt crowded after weeks of the quiet woods. As they rode into town, Elias could feel eyes on them. People stopped what they were doing to watch, some with idle curiosity, others with something sharper. He guided the wagon to the general store and climbed down, offering his hand to Margaret as she stepped off. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust and dried goods. Margaret immediately busied herself with choosing what they needed: sacks of flour and beans, some sugar, a spool of thread, a bit of fabric. Elias handled the heavier items while she kept to the smaller things. She moved quietly, but she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the store following her. 2 women near the counter whispered to one another. "That's the woodsman," one said, "and he's got a woman with him. With children, I heard." Imagine that, the other murmured, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Living out there with a stranger. No proper home. No husband. Shameful. Margaret's hand stilled on the fabric she was examining. Her cheeks flushed, and a lump formed in her throat. She had grown used to being looked down upon, but it still hurt, especially now, when she had tried so hard to hold her head high for the sake of her children. She kept her eyes on the bolts of cloth, pretending not to hear, but the words clung to her all the same. As they moved to the counter to pay, the whispers continued, now joined by the low chuckle of a man leaning against the wall. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said with a smirk. "The mighty Elias Walker, taking in a widow and her brood. Were you running there, Walker? A boarding house? Or something else?" The laughter that followed was short, but cruel. Margaret froze, shame crawling up her neck like fire. Her fingers tightened on the small sack of sugar she was holding. She wished she could disappear into the floor. Before she could speak, Elias turned slowly to face them. His expression was calm, but there was steel in his eyes. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and steady. The smirk on the man's face faltered. "Just a bit of talk," he said lightly. "Talk is cheap," Elias said, stepping closer. "If you got work to do, do it. If not, find someone else to bother. This woman and her children have been through more than you'll ever know, and I'll not have you or anyone else here speak of them like that." The store had gone silent. Everyone stared. Elias's words hung in the air like a challenge. The man muttered something under his breath and looked away, suddenly very interested in the floor. The two women who had been whispering shrank back behind the shelves. Margaret stood very still, stunned by the way Elias had spoken for her. No one had ever defended her like that, not since her husband had died. She blinked hard, fighting the tears that pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Come on," Elias said gently, picking up the sacks of supplies and heading for the door. She followed him outside into the fresh air, breathing deeply as though she had been holding her breath inside. They loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence. Only when they were on the road back to the forest did she finally speak. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, still staring straight ahead. "I did," Elias replied simply. "You and the children don't deserve that kind of talk. You've done nothing wrong." Margaret's throat tightened. "People will keep talking." "Let them," Elias said, glancing at her. "They don't matter." Something in the way he said it, firm and sure, without any doubt, settled deep in her chest. For so long she had carried the weight of other people's judgment, but beside Elias, for the first time, she felt that maybe she didn't have to carry it alone. The rest of the ride passed in a thoughtful silence. Margaret's hands relaxed in her lap, the tension in her shoulders easing little by little as the forest came back into view. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had begun to turn gold with the late afternoon sun. Henry met them at the door, and the younger two children peeked out from behind him, eager to see what they had brought back. As they unloaded the supplies, Margaret glanced at Elias. He caught her looking and gave a small nod as though to say, "You're safe here." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the fire, her mending forgotten in her lap. She thought of the whispers in town, of the way shame had burned in her chest, and then how Elias had stood between her and all of it, like a wall. She looked at him where he sat in his chair, sharpening his axe, the firelight catching in his hair. "Thank you," she said softly. He paused, looking up. "For what?" "For today. For everything." Elias nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a warmth in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "You don't have to thank me. I told you, you and the children are safe here." Margaret smiled faintly, and for the first time since she had knocked on his door, she believed him. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only the deep forest could hold. Outside, a soft breeze whispered through the trees, and the coals in the fireplace glowed faintly, painting the cabin walls in shades of gold and amber. The children had long since gone to bed, their soft breathing barely audible from the small sleeping area Elias had given them. Only Margaret and Elias remained awake, sitting across from each other near the hearth. Margaret sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since cooled, staring into the fire. For days she'd been holding something back, words that weighed heavy on her chest. But tonight, With the children safe and the world outside so still, the silence between them pressed her to speak. She took a slow breath, then said quietly, "You know, I never thought I'd end up here. Like this." Elias looked up from the piece of wood he'd been carving. He set the knife aside, giving her his full attention. "Out here in the woods?" "Out here," she said with a faint, humorless smile. "With nothing left but my children." She paused, searching for the courage to continue. "Before all this, I had a home, a husband. We had a little farm. It wasn't much, but it was ours. He used to say that as long as we had each other, we'd be fine." And then her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat. "Then he got sick. It came fast. By the time I realized how bad it was too late." Elias said nothing, his expression steady and patient, as if to tell her she didn't need to rush. "When he died," she went on, "everything else went with him. The farm, the money, the people we thought we could count on, all of it just disappeared. One by one, the doors closed. And every day after that was just surviving, moving from one place to the next, looking for help, and trying to keep my children fed." Her hands tightened on the mug, knuckles white. "I don't think I've stopped running since that day." The fire crackled softly between them. Margaret lowered her gaze, afraid to see pity in his eyes. But what she found instead, when she glanced up again, was understanding. He wasn't looking at her like someone who pitied her. He was looking at her like someone who knew exactly what that kind of loss felt like. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "I know something about that," he said finally, his voice low. "About losing everything." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You do?" He nodded slowly. "A long time ago, I had a family too. A wife, a little girl. She was barely 4 years old." His voice softened at the memory, and for a moment there was something far away in his eyes. "We were happy. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life on that little piece of land with them." "What happened?" Margaret asked gently. "There was a fever that came through," Elias said. "Took people fast, like a fire. I buried them both within a week of each other. After that, the house was just empty. I couldn't stand it. So I left. I came out here, as far away from everything and everyone as I could get, and I stayed. Been here ever since." Margaret's chest ached as she listened. All alone, he confirmed. "For a long time, that was the only way I knew how to be. It was easier not to feel anything. Easier not to have anyone close enough to lose again." The room was silent, except for the occasional snap of a log in the fire. Margaret studied his face, the lines etched by years of solitude, and realized for the first time just how heavy that solitude must have been. She understood now why his cabin was so far away from the world, why he kept himself. His silence wasn't coldness. It was survival. "I used to think no one else could understand what it feels like," she said softly. "The way life can take everything from you and leave you standing there with nothing. But you do." Elias met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I do." Margaret blinked quickly, trying to keep the tears from spilling over. It was rare for her to talk about these things, rarer still to feel like someone was truly listening. "Sometimes I think the only thing that kept me going was them," she said, glancing toward the children's sleeping forms. "I couldn't stop, not when they needed me. And they're lucky for that," Elias said. "Lucky to have a mother who kept walking when the whole world told her to give up." The words caught her off guard. For months she had been carrying the weight of failure. The failure to keep their farm, to give her children a life she had promised them. Hearing someone tell her she had done something right felt like a spark in a long, dark room. She gave a small, shaky laugh. "I don't know if I'm strong, Elias. Most days I just feel tired." "That's the thing about strength," he said. "It doesn't always feel like it when you're in it." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The firelight flickered across their faces, and the quiet in the room felt different from the kind of quiet that had been in Elias's cabin for years. This quiet wasn't empty. It was full of shared understanding, of the unspoken knowledge that they had both walked through the same kind of pain. Finally, Margaret said, I think it's been a long time since I talked to someone who really understood." Elias nodded slowly. Me too. Something shifted between them in that moment, as if the weight they both carried had become just a little lighter, because they were no longer carrying it alone. Neither of them said the words out loud, but in the way their eyes met across the glow of the fire, it was clear. They had found someone who understood, someone who had been through the same darkness and come out the other side. Margaret let out a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening." "And thank you," Elias replied, "for trusting me with it." When they finally rose, put out the fire, and retreated to their rooms, something felt different in the cabin. There was still grief, yes, but alongside it now was something else, a fragile thread of connection, something neither of them had expected to find. And for the first time in many years, as Elias lay in bed, he didn't feel entirely alone. It began as an ordinary morning. The sky was pale and heavy with clouds, and the smell of damp earth hung in the air as Elias chopped wood just outside the cabin. Margaret was inside with the children, baking bread, while the chickens pecked lazily in the yard. No one noticed a dark line of clouds on the horizon until the wind picked up, rushing through the trees with a sudden, violent howl. By noon, the weather had changed completely. The air was thick and restless, charged with the promise of storm. Elias came inside, wiping rain from his brow. "We need to get ready," he said, his voice firm. "This one looks bad." Margaret glanced up from the table, sensing the urgency in his tone. "What do you need me to do?" "Get the children into the safest part of the cabin," he said. "I'll tie down what I can outside. If the wind turns, we might have trees coming down around us." The sky darkened fast, swallowing the daylight until the forest seemed to fall into twilight. Elias worked quickly, securing tools, pulling the wagon under shelter, and making sure the animals were locked safely in the barn. The first drops of rain hit the ground like stones, and then the storm came the roar. Inside, Margaret gathered the children in the corner farthest from the windows. The wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the shutters, while the rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like the sky was breaking apart. She wrapped an arm around Peter and pulled Clara close, her voice calm even though her heart pounded. "We're safe," she told him, over and over. "We just have to stay together." Elias burst through the door, soaked to the bone, just as a crack of thunder split the air. "The barn roof's starting to lift," he shouted over the storm. "I have to try to keep it down." Margaret looked at the children, terrified at the idea of being left alone. Then she made a decision. "I'm coming with you." "You can't," Elias began, but she was already grabbing a coat and pulling it over her shoulders. "I won't sit here while the animals die," she said, meeting his eyes. "You'll need help." For a moment, Elias hesitated, torn between protecting her and knowing he couldn't do it alone. Finally, he nodded. "Stay behind me." They pushed out into the storm together, the rain slashing at their faces, the ground turning to mud beneath their boots. Branches whipped through the air like wild arms. By the time they reached the barn, the roof was heaving with every gust, threatening to rip free entirely. "Hold that door," Elias shouted, running to grab a coil of rope. Margaret threw her weight against the barn door, bracing herself as the wind tried to tear it open. Inside, the animals stamped and cried out in panic, their fear matching her own. Working together, they lashed the roof beams down, Elias climbing up onto the loft while Margaret fed him the ropes, her hands raw and slippery from the rain. Each time a gust nearly threw him off, she braced herself and held on tighter, refusing to let him fall. At one point, a sudden crash made her spin around. A large tree branch had broken free and slammed into the side of the barn, splitting a board. She stared at the jagged hole for half a second, fear rising, but then she gritted her teeth and shouted over the wind, "We can fix that later. Just keep tying it down." When at last the roof held steady and the ropes were secure, Elias jumped down. "We've done what we can," he said, grabbing her arm. Back to the cabin. They fought their way back through the storm, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. Margaret's muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she kept going, driven by the thought of her children waiting inside. When the cabin finally came into view, the sight of its sturdy walls made her want to weep with relief. Inside, the children clung to her, their faces wet with tears. She knelt down, holding them close, whispering soothing words even as her body shook from exhaustion and cold. Elias shut the door behind them and leaned against it, breathing hard. The storm raged for hours, but they stayed together, huddled near the center of the cabin, waiting it out. By dawn, the worst of it had passed. The forest outside was a wreck. Trees toppled, branches scattered like broken bones, but the cabin and barn still stood. When Elias stepped out to survey the damage, Margaret followed, the children safe inside. Together, they looked at what remained. "You saved those animals," he said, turning to her. "If you hadn't come with me, I couldn't have done it alone." Margaret shook her head. "We just did what needed to be done." "No," Elias said firmly. "You were brave. You held that door while the wind nearly tore it off its hinges. You didn't back down." Margaret met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. In that silence, Elias saw her differently. She wasn't just a widow looking for shelter. She was strong. She was determined. She had stood beside him when things were at their worst, without hesitation. As they stood in the gray morning light, something shifted in him. He realized that what he felt for her had changed. It was no longer just kindness or responsibility that kept her and her children there. It was respect. And, though he barely allowed himself to admit it, it was something deeper, too. Back inside the cabin, as Margaret helped the children clean up and prepared a simple breakfast from what little they had, Elias watched her move with quiet purpose. The way she comforted her children, the way she carried herself even when she was worn down, it struck him in a way nothing had in years. That day, while the forest slowly dried around them, Elias knew something with absolute clarity. He no longer saw Margaret as a burden. He saw her as a partner, someone whose strength matched his own, someone who had walked through hardship and stood tall on the other side. And for the first time in years, hope took root in his heart. The storm had left scars across the forest. Trees snapped in half. The barn patched roughly where the branch had struck, and muddy ruts carved deep into the ground. But in the days that followed, the cabin was full of motion and purpose. Elias and Margaret worked side by side to repair what had been damaged, the children helping in their own small ways. There was a quiet determination in every hammer strike and every piece of what they replaced, as though rebuilding the land was also rebuilding something inside them. Margaret found herself enjoying these days, even in their hard labor. There was something deeply comforting in working together, in seeing the results of their efforts rise from the chaos of storm. And every evening, when the sun sank behind the pines, they would gather inside, tired but content, sharing a meal and a sense of survival that went far beyond just enduring the weather. One evening, when the repairs were nearly finished, Elias sat on the porch steps, his axe leaning beside him. The children were inside, laughing over some game Clara had made up, their voices a melody in the background. Margaret came out, brushing sawdust from her hands, and sat beside him. The golden light of sunset spilled over the clearing, catching the edges of her hair. "They sound happy," she said softly, nodding toward the cabin. "They are," Elias replied, "happier than I've heard them in a long time." There was a pause, a comfortable quiet. Then he turned to her. "Margaret, I've been thinking about something since the storm." She looked at him curiously. "What is it?" He took a breath, steadying himself. "That night, when everything was crashing down around us, you didn't think twice. You stood with me, shoulder to shoulder. I realized something then. You and those children, you become my family, whether I plan it or not." Her breath caught at his words. She opened her mouth to speak, but he went on. "I don't want you to leave," Elias said. "Not ever. This cabin, it isn't just mine anymore. It's ours, if you want it to be. I've spent years telling myself I'd be alone until the end, but you've shown me that there's more to life than surviving." Margaret's eyes shimmered in the fading light. "Elias, I'm not a man of fancy words," he said quietly, "but I can promise you this. If you'll stay, if you'll choose to build a life here with me, I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you and your children have a home, a place where you never have to run again." Her hands trembled in her lap. She had never imagined hearing words like that again. For so long, she had thought love and safety were things that belonged to another life. And yet, Here they were, being offered to her in the most honest way she had ever known. Slowly, Margaret reached for his hand. "I want that," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "I want that with you." The simple words lit something in Elias's chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He held her hand gently, as though afraid the moment would vanish if he squeezed too tightly. "Then it's settled," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "We'll make it official. Not in a church or with papers, just us here where it started." 2 days later, they chose a quiet spot in the clearing near the cabin, under the tall pines that stood through the storm. It wasn't a grand wedding, just a simple commitment. Margaret wore a clean dress, one she had mended herself, and Elias had shaved and brushed his hair until he looked almost like a different man. Henry stood beside his mother proudly, holding Peter's hand, while Clara carried a small bunch of wildflowers she had picked from the edge of the forest. Elias spoke first. "I've got no vows written down," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But I can tell you this. From this day forward, I'll stand by you, just like you stood by me when the storm came. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Margaret smiled through her tears. "And I promise," she said softly, "to make this cabin more than just a shelter. I'll make it a home for you, for the children, for all of us." There was no preacher, no crowd, just a whisper of the trees and the sound of their promises binding them. Elias bent his head and kissed her gently, sealing a new chapter of their lives. That night, the cabin was filled with the sound of laughter. Clara placed her flowers in a jar on the table. Henry and Peter argued over who got the first slice of bread, and Margaret laughed as she scolded them, her voice full of life. Elias sat back, watching the scene with a heart so full it almost hurt. Where once there had been silence and emptiness, there was now warmth and joy. Later, as the children played outside in the fading light, Margaret stood beside him on the porch. The air smelled of pine and new beginnings. "I never thought I'd find a place like this again," she said. "And I never thought I'd have a family again," Elias replied, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "But here we are." They stood there together, watching the children run and laugh, the sound carrying out across the clearing. For Elias, who had spent so many years believing his life had ended with his loss, the truth was undeniable. He had found something new, something worth living for. And as the sun dipped behind the forest, the man who once lived alone looked at the home before him and knew that he had been given a second chance, a life no longer defined by solitude, but by love.